Hi, I'm Christopher McClinton. Thanks for being with us here again today for this episode of xtnsbl Podcast. And I am delighted to have as a guest today Chris Dickin from Zafin. Chris, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
It's a pleasure. We have a lot of exciting things going on between our two companies, and I want to get to that, but maybe you could get us underway for those who may not know, the viewers who may not know. Tell us a little bit about Zafin.
Sounds good. Maybe just as way of intro, Chris, thanks for the introduction here and having us on the podcast. I'm Chris. I lead the partner strategy here at Zafin. And as a way of intro about Zafin, Zafin is a company that's been around for about 20 years. And we probably resolve one of the most complex dilemmas in the banking technology space today. And so that is, how do you as a bank modernize your core systems while retaining the capability to actually continue your growth strategy? Because what we've seen over the last few decades is that any bank that attempts that loses 3 to 5, maybe sometimes more time on the strategy for growth, right? And so that's unacceptable. The question is, how do you do that? And so that's essentially what I think we'll dive into in more detail.
Yeah, it's not okay to just put the growth strategy on pause for a couple of years while you sort that out in terms of your transformation. So, well, what is making the Zafin platform just uniquely suited to help with that?
So if you think about how the core modernization paradigm comes about, usually what happens is you've got the lines of business that are wanting to innovate from a product and pricing standpoint, or from a product maybe standpoint first. And then they'll probably go down the hallway and knock on the CIO's door and say, hey, I need to do this. What could you do for me? And the response to that has, over the past few years, typically been, well, we've got a challenge, and that challenge is the incumbent core. The incumbent core does not allow for agility for going to market. It has significant costs. Like if I have to create a new product or proposition in the market, the cost of doing that is substantial, both in actual cost as well as in time, because as you well know, some of these incumbent cores take a substantial amount of time to actually go through the release cycle, etc. And so that's when your new product will be coming out. And in some cases, not all, you do have cases where there's a decreasing amount of knowledge, and there's not an increasing amount of engineers coming out of university that want to learn COBOL. Yeah. And so that is another aspect that we try to resolve. So for what we do is we offer a enterprise product and pricing platform, which effectively allows a bank to start to externalize components of the core, which have been heavily customized over the years. And so by doing that, by externalizing the capability to create marketable instances of new products and prices in the market, it the conversation around, can I continue to innovate in product and pricing in the market? And it decouples it from the discussion and the conversation and the strategy as to what do I do with my incumbent core? How do I modernize this? How do I de-risk that whole process of flipping on the switch from an older core or an incumbent core to a newer core, like Finxact, for example?
That's what I find so fascinating about what you guys have done. It's almost as though you're solving for, an immediate problem, which is just the way that you had brought product configuration and pricing configuration, together very harmoniously so that the banks can have a full view of the customer relationship. But you also brought that along at a time when, just as you're saying, it's providing a much needed bridge during a core modernization project. So maybe delve into that a little bit more. What are the benefits of having that? I don't want to say accompany a core transformation project, but maybe, because it is an extremely helpful bridge.
Yeah. So I think what's happened over the last few years is, if you look at the strategies of core modernization at tier 1, tier 2 banks, which is primarily the space that we have been working on at historically, the paradigm that they were facing was, okay, my options for enabling the line of business to modernize products and prices and to go with new propositions to the customers is, number one, I can decide on a new core and flip the switch, or as sometimes they say, go cold turkey and flip the switch and transition. And we have seen over the years that that is not an option anymore. No tier 1, tier 2 bank and no CIO who's in the right mind is doing that today, or very few. The second option that the banks had then was to say, okay, I'm going to try out a sidecar with a neocore. That could be either a Gen 2 or Gen 3 core like Finxact, and test it out. And so that in some cases a lot of banks have gone down that path and have tested it out. The question now becomes, okay, if I select that, how do I transition from one to another easily and de-risk that? Number one. Number two is, if I'm starting off on that neo core, how do I really pay attention to who is important to me, which is the end customer? How to retain the understanding of that full relationship of that customer across numerous cores, right? And so there was not an easy solution to that. But that's essentially where we come in. The Zafin platform, as you externalize product and prices from the cores, from the GLs, if you like, from that system of records, you separate those two things from each other. Then suddenly the transition from one to another becomes easier, number one. Number two, if you're testing out new products on a Finxact core, for example, then you still can enable and retain the full understanding of what that relationship is from the customer to the bank across numerous cores, not just Finxact, but maybe other incumbent cores, maybe some credit card cores, maybe even insurance, right? So you retain that understanding and can benefit your customer based on the full relationship across the core. So that's where we play. And then obviously, as you start to look at where we're in 2024, banking products haven't really evolved that much. When you look at the last 2 decades, banks have been focused primarily on the front end, primarily on the channels to make them beautiful, as I say. Like if you compare a bank to a shop on the street, it's been all about the display, but they haven't focused that much on the actual product that they put on the shelf and the packages, right? And so that's where we come into play too. So if you're considering a Gen 3 core like Finxact and you want to put in place a new proposition with Finxact, we can also externalize and combine things that are running on Finxact, running on the incumbent core to create a package for the customer that then starts to be a Neo type of proposition in 2024.
Yes, that's very clear. And, I would say in addition to being such a helpful facilitator, because as you said, there's so much institutional knowledge about, Christopher or, the given customer in the bank, but probably siloed against many, around the bank and many departments, many different cores. And so bringing that together in a way that lets you price that customer, in a very bespoke and a very personalized way is really cool. And that's just been something that I've been really impressed by, just getting more familiar with your solutions. And moreover, to do it with the ability to, maybe at some point we can have another go in an episode and talk more specifically about some of the innovations that you're introducing in the product and around the product configuration area, but just the adjustments that you can make, whether you're creating deposit accounts, loan accounts with rates and with fees, it goes above and beyond what, Finxact as a system of record would be able to do. So that's just extremely complementary.
Yeah. Like if I have to augment what you just said there, Chris, I think there is a natural symbiosis between a Gen 3 core like Finxact and Zafin, right? So you are all about the volume processing, speed, and security of the transactions that are occurring for a customer, right? And obviously you do have a representation of the product, which is what we call a technical representation of the product on the core, right? What we do is externalize and enable the banks to create the marketable instance of those products.
Yeah.
So what the actual bank sells to its customers. By doing that, it also elevates the capability for a bank to modernize and extend also their product management capability at the bank, right? So in the past, if you look at how product management at banks worked, it was mostly maybe program or project management that actually had deep technical expertise to how to manage a technical project to enable a new product on the core. By doing this between Finxact and Zafin, what you're moving is towards an environment where you have specific engineers that are dedicated to the core, like in this case Finxact, but you've got real product management capabilities and folks that now can focus on, okay, what is it that we're actually going to create here for the product? What's the target market? How do we compose these things together? What's going to be the pricing methodology? and push it into market really fast without having the dependency on changes that need to happen on the core.
You're precisely correct. Finxact is and I think there really are maybe just a handful of the next gen cores, but it is part of that generational leap from legacy systems to the next gen cores was, abstracting it to that level of this is a position keeping platform, and certainly doesn't diminish it. But just as you said, the positions, all types of positions representing different types of products for the bank, very different behaviors, and importantly, the transaction processing engine against those positions. So having the ability to then have that sort of technical template for a product in the SOR, but then have it be hyper personalized and externalized by Zafin, it's quite a symbiosis. And then it sounds kind of funny, but we always talk about product innovation, and I think what comes to mind most of the time is features. How quickly can you onboard a customer, and what are the contextual and appropriate offers or whatever that you can put in front of them. But Zafin is also sort of creating an opportunity to innovate around pricing, and I think that's really cool. And you don't think about that a lot as an area of innovation, but that's what I see in there.
Yeah, there's definitely there are many areas to look at and many angles from where to look at this at, right? So we really play within the core modernization paradigm. That said, what you just mentioned is absolutely true. The first thing that banks are trying to figure out is, okay, what do I do with my core? How do I modernize this? At the end of the day, at some point, the incumbent cores will have to be replaced and changed. And that's where I think the combination of Zafin and Finxact come in. Now, if you look forward a little bit, but not too far forward, because there are fintechs and companies out there are starting to think about it and do this. It's okay, you need to modernize your product, but how do you think about that and what do you do? So sometimes the story that I tell is, think about it as, I'm going out into the market and I want to buy a house. I'm buying a house, I'm not buying a mortgage. And so now the question is, how can the bank help me with everything related to me buying a house? And so is there a package there that could potentially entice me to buy a full package and not just the mortgage? And so, for example, I'm really in the market for the mortgage, but I'm also in the market or looking for my legal fees. I'm also in the market for maybe home IoT. I'm in the market for home insurance. So why can't those things be combined and packaged together? What if the package also contained, as you rightly said, a method to subscribe to components within the package, like Netflix paid for or through the bank, and maybe I turn it on and off. And so those possibilities are something that could potentially be enabled by the bank as a package, right? And so it's addressing those potential needs of the market and the fact that, this is essentially an innovation strategy for the bank to be able to do that. Now, to do that, you really need a bunch of things, right? You really need the enterprise layer that allows you to do that. You need the appropriate GLs or the appropriate cores at the bottom to be able to do that too, right? So it's not just an incumbent core, but you probably also need a neo core that allows you to do certain type of propositions. You also maybe need to combine it with the credit card, right? Because you could package the credit card into that too. So there are things that you need there. There's also one interesting thing is that we've launched also what is called Zafin IO, and I think was one of the points that we were going to talk about further along. But Zafin IO is, think about it as a full enterprise integration and orchestration layer. So what that means is decouple the integration components and the orchestration of the data from the product and pricing platform where essentially you innovate on product and pricing, okay? What that means is banks have multiple streams of data and systems that they need to integrate to be able to then create the value for product and pricing. What that means is systems of record like cores like Finxact and maybe the incumbents plus maybe the CRM, etc., all have data. And now the question is, how do you use that data to create the rules to enable the eligibility and suitability for the product for a person or the pricing for a person? And so that data can be anything. Like, what if that data came from, I don't know, your fridge or your home IoT, which you had packaged in before, and the fridge is sending signals that it's about to die. So now the question is, can the bank take that data stream and essentially source it up as an LOC for a customer in the future?
Mm.
Why couldn't you? So any data stream that is coming could be useful, obviously allowed by the customer, right? But any data stream can be used then for the creation of propositions for a customer, to create a proposition to help them out on a daily basis. So banking becomes less of a chore. It becomes something that actually helps me out.
Yeah, I think it just creates a world of possibility for the bankers to start thinking in directions that they weren't able to before, just with the combination of these modern technologies.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And so that's why I think the joint between Finxact and Zafin is important, because what we're moving the paradigm a little bit. What we're moving is the banks have focused literally on the last couple of decades on that front end, which we talked about. It's a full digital banking. It's the onboarding of a customer. It's making it look beautiful. It's a website. Let's be honest. It's essentially it's a display with a lot of lights. And as we all know in retail, lights enable us to look in one direction or another. That's what we try to do. And essentially this the UI and the UX. But we need to shift towards how do you change and modernize the actual products that you're putting out into the market. And that's what we can do jointly. Yeah. But to
and
do that, then obviously you need to address that lack of agility, the cost to market that the banks have today, the decreasing pool of knowledge and whatnot, right?
Finxact is it is a platform for banking, also for embedded finance. Let's just say the very large regional institutions that we're working with, they are all sort of finding their starting point that starts to look similar, which is that, okay, we're gonna either create a bundle of products and run it on Finxact, understand it better, get something to market very quickly, think about what to do next. Or maybe they go a step further and they're creating a digital brand, just sort of under the mothership, if you
Yeah.
will. Same thesis, though, really, just kind of with a marketing budget. The point is to sort of, hey, let's begin. We know this is an exercise that needs to get done, and this is kind of a pragmatic way to get started. And that is precisely where we together are 1 and 1 is 3. I mean, because
Exactly.
that new offering, digital brand or bank, whatever it is, it's going to there needs to be awareness between that and the existing systems in the bank, and you guys are very neatly providing that bridge.
Yeah, and as I sort of talk about it sometimes, the lack of interconnection between those two, like you're standing up a separate sidecar, if you like, and a separate brand even, is that what banks have resolved that by essentially what I call sneakerware. And sneakerware is a bunch of guys that are running around in the back end to try to create the dots between, okay, this customer has this on this brand X on one side and this on brand Y on the other side, using different technologies, right? And so now what we bring to the table is a ways to help the bank do a few things, which is retain that linkage and understanding of the full relationship between the customer and the bank across multiple different cores. We're also enabling them to test out the neo cores like Finxact with a future vision of moving down a path of replacement, right? At some point in time, there will be no knowledge on COBOL, for example. And so you're creating an easier path where you're de-risking that future migration from the older incumbent core over to Finxact.
And you are indeed, but there's also immediate value. You're along the way,
Yeah.
you're monetizing something that you wouldn't have been able to, as you said, I think at the top of our conversation. Like, you can't put pause on your growth strategy. So in a sense, it can help to kind of a virtuous circle, help to sort of fund that project and get it to its endpoint.
Bang on. That is exactly what some of these tier 1 and tier 2 banks are doing, which is essentially exactly that. It's you externalize product and pricing, which allows you to continue to innovate, and that it now funds the future core migration that you still need to do anyway. So instead of having a massive loss or a massive budget that you need for a core transition, now you're essentially funding it via the new propositions that you're putting it in the market.
Yeah. Well, we are really excited about the partnership between Finxact and Zafin, and it's more than slideware and more than sneakerware. Our collaboration has been fruitful already, and it's produced some very real use cases that demonstrate, the synergy that you've been describing. maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
We are working on jointly on a common client, as you know. Obviously, we cannot disclose who that is for the audience yet, but the movement is towards creating, exactly as we've been discussing here, propositions or new products on a Finxact core integrated back into Zafin, which has already been done. So that connection is already done. And then Zafin being that layer across both the incumbent core and Finxact for products and pricing. And so we're in the throes of that, and it's moving nicely forward. And we're talking here of using that combination for a tier one bank in North America. But obviously, once that's in production, that will be a essentially reusable and natural path to be able to use across any type of bank. So the activity between Finxact and Zafin can be reutilized. And then obviously we have multiple connections into incumbent cores that obviously can be leveraged. And so no matter what that core is, no matter what institution they're on, we can definitely work together on it.
Well, we're thrilled about it, and it's fun to watch the interaction. I've enjoyed, seeing that from Nisha and John and your team. Let me ask you a question with the maybe remaining time we have. Describe I don't know whether to say personas or profiles, but what is the profile of a bank, or some examples of the profile of a bank that would and should be talking to Zafin?
To be honest, I think it's every single bank. As I've mentioned at the beginning, like our focus has originally been tier one and tier two banks, global banks. Like we have in our roster the HSBCs of this world, the Wells Fargo's, ING, so a whole bunch, ANZ, PNC. So there's a whole bunch of large bank institutions that we work with. That said, we also work with some credit unions, smaller institutions, because there's definitely a recognition of a need for what we bring to the table. There's definitely a recognition across all of those institutions that they need to start figuring out what to do. And they're all asking the same questions: what to do with their core? How do they institute real product management at their organizations, right? And in some cases, I would say that maybe for the lower end of the market, it becomes even more paramount for them to start looking and understanding what to do, because that's the way for them to start understanding how to compete in a crowded market. So I think it's across the board. We service most institutions above, I want to say, 5 billion in assets and above. However, our sweet spot is probably going to be the large institutions for now, because they understand, or that's where they're focusing on their massive core modernizations, because that's what they have on the table, right on the plate. Some organizations we know and work with have probably more than 10 cores that they need to start thinking, how do they amalgamate the data from all of these cores and help them out towards moving towards one single core. So in those scenarios, in an M&A strategy where they acquire a bank and they have multiple cores, or they're forced to it, or they've tested multiple cores and that's what they have on the plate, they have to really migrate from many to one. That's where it's also a sweet spot for our play.
And for Finxact, because
exactly.
Finxact is an end state for collapsing those silos. They don't necessarily have to exist, and all of the technical debt that sort of accompanies them. Well, this has been really, as I said, just watching the partnership come along, watching it bear fruit, watching customers really take notice, and just watching us proceed together is a lot of fun, super exciting. And I just thank you for giving us a little bit of your time to, as I said, help the folks following Extensible podcasts understand it better. And maybe you'll be back with some more news for us soon.
Would love to. I think the next one, we should have a common client that we can actually talk about. We're working on it, and I think it will be super exciting as to what we're doing and what can bring to the table for everybody else, right?
I agree. All right. Well, enjoy your day, and thanks again for stopping by.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. And yeah, looking forward to the next one, Chris.